Welcome to LenBook number 2, which is the second installment in this kind of parallel track to Len Talks, which are lectionary-based semiotic reflections on biblical narratives. This is just a fun kind of compilation of some of the backstories of the books that I've written. And today, this is Women's History Month. So I want to feature a couple of the books that I've written on women's history and women in ministry. I also want to acknowledge that this is Holy Week, 2024 Holy Week. And one of the biggest things you and I have got to get out of our mind is that the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, was 12 guys sitting at one side of the table looking out, getting history's first selfie. This is a Passover meal. It took place in a triclinium room, a U-shaped table, and a Passover meal was a family meal. And the idea that there were no women or children at the Last Supper in the upper room, after his death, when they gathered at the upper room, and just before at Pentecost, there were women there. There were women disciples everywhere. It doesn't say 12 apostles gathered. It says 12 disciples. And the idea that, okay, you only got 12 men there that can share in the Eucharist. Well, how come women from the very beginning were invited to share in the Eucharist and participate at the table? So this whole notion, this is a Passover meal. These 12 guys just didn't get together and cook themselves a meal without the family, without the children. This is so. Just let me say from the beginning, put all my cards on the table. I've taught my students this from the very beginning, that we need to rethink the whole imagery. First of all, it's not a table with all of them sitting on one side. It's a U-shaped triclinium table. Recliners, they were called family recliners because the whole family, it was like a family couch. The whole family would be at each one, and women would have been present at the Last Supper. So just as we think about Holy Week and come up to this Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples, not just with his apostles, with his disciples. And we know Jesus had a lot of women disciples. I come at this by birth, by both nature and nurture. I'm a PK, and the preacher in my household was my mother, who was ordained in the Pilgrim Holiness Church and a licensed local preacher. She met my father at a church plant that she was starting in Newport News, Virginia, was doing a series of revival meetings, and he was a Free Methodist. Now, both the Pilgrim Holiness, that later became the Wesleyan Methodist, because they merged with the Wesleyan Methodist Church, it's called the Wesleyan Church, and the Free Methodists were pioneers in women in ministry. The first woman ordained in America, Antoinette Brown Blackwell. The preacher at her service in 1853 was Luther Lee, who with Orange Scott founded the Wesleyan Methodist Church. They were firebrands, anti-slavery, women's equality. And then, of course, B.T. Roberts and Ellen Stowe Roberts, who founded the Free Methodist Church. They were a tag team, really, in ministry together. And they shared platforms together. And arguably, the best case in the 19th century for why women should be ordained was written by B.T. Roberts in 1891. So the whole question of ordination of women in the Wesleyan holiness tradition was settled for me very early on, because I'm a PK, but the preacher was my mother. I'm a preacher's son whose preacher parent was a woman. And so I grew up with women preachers. I grew up not having a problem with women in ministry. And so I came at this, as I say, this egalitarian understanding of women in ministry equal to men in ministry, honestly, by both nature being born into that kind of environment, and by nurture, by growing up. I wrote a history, my own history. This is the closest I'll ever come to a memoir of what it's like to grow up in a household where you had a woman preacher. And I tell the story of my mother, Mabel Boggs Sweet, here. It's called Mother Tongue. The subtitle is How Your Heritage Shapes Your Story. And this is the story of growing up in this holiness tradition, and with here's a preacher of my mother. One of my prize certificates is her ordination certificate. I had a lot of fun writing this book. It was not the easiest book to write, because in researching this book, I found a suicide note my mother had written and had hidden. And it just became so frustrating for her doing ministry in a world where it was not easy for women to do ministry. Even after she married my father, and she stopped she married my father in her late 30s. It was not she had been single up until then. She had just been doing ministry, church plants, missionary, revivals, but she still kept it going. And when I was real little, my brothers and I kind of formed a Sweet family. We were somewhat musical. We were not that good, but we were cute. We're all about a year apart, and so she would dress us up alike, and we'd go on the revival circuit, and we'd do a song and dance, and she'd preach, and then we'd collect the offertory and then go to the next camp meeting. But it was not easy for her, and I tell that story, and it was so not easy with her call to ministry, and yet having to raise 3 children, and at the same time having this real sense of being both a mother and a preacher, and how do you handle both together? And my brothers are not all that happy, I think, that I shared that little bit of our backstory in this book, but it's called Mother Tongue. And as I said, it was fun writing it. It was great capturing those memories, but this was not the easiest book I have written. The story of my growing up in this holiness tradition, and the story of my deconversion from it. Some people have a momentous conversion experience. I had a 17 AD conversion experience where I said, I'm done. I've had it, been there, done that. I'm out of here. And from 17 to about 23, I didn't sow wild oats. I planted a prairie, and that also story is in here as well, the Mother Tongue story. But the earliest evidence is I'm struggling with what it's like to grow up in this kind of a household where we have very strong women, and that's a good thing. I wrote a book right early on, a scholarly book called The Minister's Wife, Her Role in 19th Century American Evangelicalism. And I was inspired here, my kind of linchpin was the wives of Charles G. Finney, the father of urban evangelism and revivalism. He's the one that began the altar call tradition. In many ways, you could think of Charles G. Finney and Billy Graham as bookends, because they did basically the same thing. But the way in which Charles G. Finney had a partnership with his wife, who went in ahead of him, especially his third wife. You have tremendous mortality rates here for women who giving birth to children, and in fact, many women, when they went into childbirth, wrote their will, what they wanted to do with their things when they died, because it was that kind of danger going through childbirth. We have no idea what our ancestors went through to bring us to where we are today. But his Elizabeth Atkinson Finney, she was his third wife after Lydia, who also partnered with him, but not as much as this Elizabeth Atkinson, because she went in ahead of time where Charles G. Finney was going to do his revivals, and she would conduct prayer meetings. She'd organize prayer groups. She'd kind of plow the ground with prayer and lead these prayer meetings. And so I got caught up in studying that and spent quite a bit of time researching this. Part of it, too, was I spent 6 months just researching the women's seminary movement. It's called female seminary movement in the 19th century, which is where we get the word seminary from. Initially, though, seminaries were higher education for women. And so I studied that movement. I went all around, took notes. By the way, I read, for this one, I must have read like 200 or more circuit rider autobiographies just to get the stories, the backstories of these women, both white and black. The whole story of black ministers' wives also was included here. But I spent all this time, and I got this book out of it. I got this article out of it, which I first delivered to the American Society of Church History as a paper, and published it in the Church History Journal. And basically, so this takes about 2 years of my life writing these two things and traveling and doing the research. And after my article was published in Church History, I read another article that the average academic journal article has a readership of 3.6 people. And I'm telling you, when I read that, it really hit me hard. This academic journey I was on, scholarship, I'm writing for other scholars, basically. Now, this had a little more appeal because it's the story of ministers' wives and what a leadership role they had, especially in the Methodist tradition when the itinerants are off around all the time. So who's maintaining and leading the local church? Well, it's the minister's wife who's really, and they often function as exhorters. So the preacher would preach, and then they would exhort, and they would preside at the altar call. And it's when the circuit rider dismounted in the second half of the 19th century, when he stopped traveling and then he came home, that women then began to be pushed back, especially in the Methodist tradition, the Wesleyan tradition. Methodists specifically, they were pushed back, pushed down, and told to stay in their place because I'm going to take over now. I'm back home. And so we have it's called a settled ministry. And that's when you have the rise of these Wesleyans and these Free Methodists, Salvation Army, William and Catherine Booth. They're all responding to this kind of suppression of women, and they're breaking forth in whole new ways. I do think, and there's a whole other conversation, that if John Wesley had been allowed, without his brother interfering, to enter into, to fulfill a marriage with Grace Murray, the woman he really loved and who he traveled with and had a preaching partnership with, and this is a whole other story, that we would have been to where we were in the latter part of the 19th century with these tag team couples a lot earlier. But Charles intervened, smashed that proposal of marriage that John Wesley, and arguably he actually was in a marriage relationship with her, because what we call today engagement was a legal binding contract until 1855 that you had to, 1755, that you had to get a divorce to get out of. So there's a whole bunch of questions here about what might have been if Charles had not interfered, because Grace Murray was the widow of a ship's captain, and ship's captains didn't have that great a reputation, and he thought that marrying her would sully John's reputation. And actually, the third wife, Molly Vazeal, is the one that really messed him up. But that's a whole other conversation. But this is, when I read that, 3.6 readers per article. it just hit me so hard. I've spent the last 2 years focusing on this, and I had also agreed, and this is to my everlasting shame, I agreed to write the biography for Phoebe Palmer, one of my great heroes, 19th century women preacher heroes, for the American Women's Autobiography series. And I never finished it, but I did all this research for it. And I apologize to all those that counted on me to come up with a manuscript, and I just, life passed me by in doing this. But I have boxes and boxes of notes if anybody wants them. But on Phoebe Palmer and her importance and the significance of her role and this whole altar theology that she came up with, and its significance for the development of American religious history. But I spent 2 years on this, and all of a sudden it just hit me. I'm doing this for 3.6 readers. And I'm not sure I had many more than that reading The Minister's Wife as to the article that appeared in Church History. So then I began to open myself up to write for a wider audience than just other academic scholars. And so you have this then, which is written for everybody, but it started with this, The Minister's Wife, Her Role in 19th Century Evangelicalism. I really cannot thank my mother, Mabel Velma Boggs Sweet, enough for shaping me to understand that in Christ there is neither male nor female, that we are all equal. And I've never had to fight these fights that other tribes are having to fight. Is it complementarian or egalitarian? I've never had to just ponder whether women could or should be ordained. The proof was in the pudding, and the pudding for me was my background as a PK, where the preacher in my household was my mother. I hope you have this is a Holy Week book, LenBook, but it's a Holy Week LenBook that wants to remind you of the importance of women to this story of Holy Week, and to leave them out. I mean, you should never talk about the feeding of the 5,000, ever. Just, you should feel a pang of guilty conscience if even it comes to your mind, because it says 5,000 men, not including women and children. I mean, that's a big flare. So whenever you're reading these biblical stories, these narratives, and talking about the disciples, there's 12 apostles, but there's many disciples and women disciples, and we may even come to find out that some of these women disciples were, or as the Roman Catholic Church calls Mary Magdalene, the apostle to the apostles. So 2 of my books, in line to doing the rest of them, so we've done 3 now, The Minister's Wife and the story of what it's like to grow up in the holiness tradition with a preacher for a mother tongue.